3 little girls went to sleep in a tent in the Oklahoma woods. By morning, they were gone, and the man almost everyone believed did it walked free. This is the story of the Girl Scout camp that closed its gates forever, and the murder case that even now, nearly 50 years later, has never been officially solved. June 1977. Camp Scott sits deep in the Cookson Hills of Mayes County, Oklahoma, a few miles outside the small town of Locust Grove. It's been a Girl Scout camp since 1928, 410 acres of dense forest, hiking trails, a lake, and rows of platform tents tucked into the trees. Generations of Oklahoma girls spent their summers here. For the girls boarding the bus in Tulsa on June 12th, it was just the beginning of another 2-week camp session. For 3 of them, it would be the last night of their lives. Lori Lee Farmer was 8 years old, from Tulsa. Michelle Goose was 9, from the Tulsa suburb of Broken Arrow. Doris Denise Milner was 10, also from Tulsa. The 3 girls didn't know each other well. They'd simply been assigned to the same tent, tent number 8, in a unit called Kiowa. It was the tent farthest from the counselors' quarters, tucked behind the camp's shower house, half hidden by the trees. That placement would matter more than anyone could have known. Here's what makes this case so unsettling from the very start. The warning came before the girls ever arrived. Weeks earlier, during a counselor training session at the camp, someone ransacked a staff member's belongings and stole a box of donuts. Inside the empty box, whoever did it left a note, printed in block capital letters. "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in Tent 1. Camp leadership treated it as a prank. Nobody called the police. Nobody moved the tents. Camp opened as scheduled. On the night of June 12th, a storm rolled through the hills. Around midnight, a counselor named Carla Wilhite woke to a strange, guttural sound drifting from somewhere near the main camp road. She got up, listened, decided it was probably an animal, and went back to bed. She would spend the rest of her life wondering about that decision. At around 6 the next morning, Wilhite was walking the trail toward the shower house when she saw something in the underbrush that stopped her cold, a sleeping bag, crumpled at odd angles, roughly 150 yards from the Kiowa tent. She moved closer. What she found were the bodies of all 3 girls from Tent 8. 2 of the girls were still zipped partway into a shared sleeping bag. The 3rd lay nearby, partially clothed, on the trail itself. All 3 had been beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted. Investigators believe 2 of the girls were killed inside the tent itself, while the 3rd was taken a short distance into the woods. The scene told its own story to the officers who processed it. Blood marked the wooden platform floor of the tent, smeared in places as though someone had tried hastily to wipe it away with a towel and a mattress cover, both of which were later found stuffed inside the girls' sleeping bags. Investigators recovered duct tape, cordage, and a flashlight left behind at the scene. Footprints were found both inside and outside the tent, though they didn't match in size, suggesting more than one set of prints, though not necessarily more than one person moving through the area at different times. A nearby landowner later told investigators he'd heard unusual traffic on a road near the camp sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning. Law enforcement descended on Camp Scott within hours. Camp staff loaded the rest of the young campers onto buses and sent them home to Tulsa that same morning without explanation. For a few unbearable hours, parents waiting at the drop-off point had no idea whether their own daughters would be among the girls stepping off those buses. Camp Scott never held another summer session. It closed permanently within 2 months, and the property was eventually sold in 1985. It has sat empty and overgrown ever since. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation and the Mayes County Sheriff's Office launched a massive manhunt. Investigators eventually recovered a partial fingerprint from a flashlight lens at the scene, but were unable to make an identification from it at the time. Suspicion soon fell on one man, Gene Leroy Hart, known locally as Sonny. Hart, a member of the Cherokee Nation who had grown up about a mile from the camp, had escaped from the Mayes County Jail back in 1973. He was already a convicted rapist. Years earlier, he'd kidnapped 2 pregnant women at gunpoint, driven them into the countryside, raped them, and left them for dead. He'd served only about 2.5 years for that crime before being paroled, then escaped custody on unrelated charges, and had been living as a fugitive in the surrounding hills ever since. Investigators found what they considered damning circumstantial evidence. A cave roughly a mile from the crime scene, discovered by a campgrounds keeper weeks before the murders, contained items including a stolen pair of glasses and photographs that were eventually traced back to Hart. To investigators, it looked like a hideout, proof Hart had been watching the camp. But there was a problem that would haunt the case for decades. Nothing recovered directly from the murder scene itself could be conclusively tied to Hart. Hair samples were said at the time to resemble his, but 1970s, forensic science had no way to confirm a match with certainty. It took 10 months, but in April 1978, authorities finally tracked Hart down, hiding at the home of a Cherokee medicine man in the Cookson Hills. He was arrested and charged with the murders. Hart's trial began in March 1979, held in Pryor, Oklahoma. It divided the community. Many local residents and members of Hart's family believed he was innocent, and some raised money for his legal defense. His attorney argued the prosecution's case relied on circumstantial evidence and inconclusive forensic testing. No eyewitnesses, no confession, no scientifically reliable match linking Hart directly to the scene. The Mayes County Sheriff at the time, Glenn Pete Weaver, told reporters he was, in his words, 1,000% certain of Hart's guilt. It didn't matter. After less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: not guilty. The acquittal stunned Oklahoma. But it didn't set Hart free. As an escaped convict already serving more than 300 years for his earlier kidnapping and rape convictions, Hart was sent directly back to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He would never spend another day outside prison walls. On June 4, 1979, in barely 2 months after his acquittal, Hart collapsed and died of a heart attack while exercising in the prison yard. He was 35 years old. With Hart's death, the case that had gripped Oklahoma for 2 years lost its only formally charged suspect and any chance of a courtroom resolution. Officially, the murders of Lori Farmer, Michelle Goose, and Doris Milner remained unsolved. For decades, the case existed in a kind of legal limbo, publicly believed solved, legally still open. Investigators returned to the physical evidence again and again as forensic science advanced. DNA testing in 1989 showed partial matches consistent with Hart on some of the genetic probes examined, though not a conclusive full match. Testing in 2008 on a pillowcase from the scene proved inconclusive. The biological material had degraded too much over the decades to produce a usable profile. Then, in 2016, Mayes County Sheriff Mike Reed, who had taken up the case at the request of Lori Farmer's parents, raised $30,000 in private donations from the local community to fund a new round of testing using modern forensic techniques. That evidence was retested in 2019. Reed also brought the case to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Virginia, where a panel of veteran homicide investigators and FBI behavioral analysts independently reviewed every document and every piece of evidence in the file. The results were not released to the public right away. Reed sat on the findings for 3 years at the family's request before going public in May 2022. Standing before reporters in 2022, Sheriff Reed delivered the announcement Mayes County had waited 45 years to hear. The new DNA analysis, he said, had systematically eliminated every other name ever floated as a suspect in the case. More than 130 people questioned over the decades are asked, while strongly pointing to one man, Gene Leroy Hart. Unless something new comes up, something brought to light we are not aware of, Reed told reporters, I am convinced, where I'm sitting, of Hart's guilt and involvement in this case. Reed was careful about the science. He acknowledged the DNA results remained officially classified as inconclusive. The genetic material recovered from the scene had never been complete enough to produce a full, courtroom-ready profile. But combined with everything else investigators had gathered, Hart's documented history as what Reed bluntly called a textbook serial rapist, his proximity to the crime scene, and the physical evidence tying him to the area around the cave, Reed said there was no reasonable doubt left in his mind. The panel of independent investigators at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reportedly reached the identical conclusion, working separately from Reed and from each other. The announcement didn't reopen the courts. It couldn't. Hart had been dead for over 4 decades, and no prosecutor can try a dead man. Reed himself was careful to note that the case could only be formally closed if the victims' families, the OSBI, the Sheriff's Office, and the District Attorney's Office all agreed. And as of the announcement, that full agreement hadn't been reached. For Lori Farmer's mother, Sherry Farmer, the DNA news brought something, but not everything. Speaking about the decades since her daughter's murder, she described it as a wound unlike ordinary grief. It's a journey I wouldn't wish on anyone, she said. It's shocking. It's different than a death. It's different than a loss, because our daughter was murdered. It was intentional, and she died with 2 other little girls that we don't want to forget either. She and her husband, she said, have found some measure of peace, but not closure. Not really. Not without a conviction. The case has continued to draw fresh attention since, following the 2020 Supreme Court ruling in McGirt v. Oklahoma, which restored substantial criminal jurisdiction over Native American-involved cases within reservation boundaries to tribal and federal authorities. The Cherokee Nation Marshal Service formally assigned an investigator to revisit the murders, given that Hart himself was a Cherokee Nation citizen. A 4-part documentary series, Keeper of the Ashes: The Oklahoma Girl Scout Murders, was released on Hulu in May 2022, hosted by Kristen Chenoweth, who, as an 8-year-old Girl Scout in 1977, had been scheduled to attend that very camp session before falling ill and staying home. Camp Scott itself never reopened. The land was sold off in 1985, and what remains of the platform tents and old camp buildings has sat quietly decaying in the Oklahoma woods for over 40 years, a place many locals still consider haunted in every sense of the word. Lori Farmer, Michelle Goose, Doris Milner, 3 names that Mays County, Oklahoma has never been allowed to forget. And thanks to the family and the sheriff, who refused to let the file gather dust, never will. If you stayed with this story until the end, thank you for being here. Subscribe for more real cold cases every week.